$63 billion in assets, gone in about 4 months. And the accounting trick that did it was, on paper, completely legal. Enron didn't just collapse. It became the textbook case for how a company can look flawless right up until the moment it doesn't exist anymore. This is how America's 7th largest company turned its own debt invisible and got a prestigious accounting firm to help. In the late 1990s, Enron wasn't a scandal. It was a role model. Fortune magazine named it America's most innovative company 6 years running. It started as a boring Texas natural gas pipeline operator and transformed itself into something new, an energy trading company, buying and selling contracts for gas, electricity, even bandwidth, years before anyone else treated energy like a financial product. Wall Street loved the story. Business schools taught it as a case study in innovation. Nobody was asking where the profits actually came from because the numbers, every quarter, kept going up. Enron stock traded at a valuation multiple far beyond what a traditional energy company could justify, priced instead like a technology growth stock investors, betting not on current profit, but on the promise that Enron would keep reinventing how entire industries traded and priced risk. That kind of valuation only holds up as long as the growth story keeps outpacing scrutiny. For years at Enron, it did exactly that. The person driving that growth was Jeffrey Skilling, who introduced something called mark-to-market, accounting to Enron's trading business. Under this method, Enron could book the entire projected profit of a long-term contract the moment the deal was signed, not as the money actually came in over years, but instantly, on paper, based on a forecast. If your forecast was right, this was aggressive but defensible. If your forecast was wrong, or simply optimistic, you'd already booked profits that might never actually materialize. And Enron's forecasts, again and again, turned out to be optimistic in exactly the direction that kept the stock price climbing. Here's the part that doesn't add up. Even with generous accounting, Enron's trading business was taking on enormous debt to fund its expansion debt, that if it showed up on the balance sheet, would have spooked investors and credit rating agencies. So the company's chief financial officer, Andrew Fastow, built a solution. Hundreds of off-the-books partnerships with names like LJM and Chuco that existed largely to take Enron's debt and bad assets off Enron's own books, move a liability into one of these partnerships, and technically, legally, it no longer belonged to Enron. The company's reported financial health had almost nothing to do with its actual financial health anymore. Someone was paid to catch this. Arthur Andersen, one of the 5 largest accounting firms in the world, audited Enron's books every year and signed off on them. Andersen was also paid tens of millions of dollars annually for consulting work on the very structures it was supposed to be independently auditing a conflict of interest that, at the time, wasn't even against the rules. Wall Street analysts, mostly, kept issuing buy ratings. Credit agencies kept Enron's debt rated as investment grade almost until the final weeks. The system built to catch exactly this kind of fraud had every incentive not to look too closely, and largely didn't. Inside Enron, the trading floor operated on a brutal internal ranking system. Employees called rank and yank every 6 months. Managers ranked staff from top to bottom. And the bottom 15% were routinely fired, regardless of the company's overall performance. The system rewarded short-term deal-making and aggressive risk-taking above almost anything else, because the metric that determined your ranking was tied directly to the paper profits you booked, not the long-term soundness of the deals behind them. That culture didn't create the accounting fraud on its own, but it made the fraud almost structurally inevitable. Traders and executives who raised concerns about aggressive mark-to-market assumptions risked being seen as underperformers in a system explicitly built to punish underperformance. The incentive, at every level, ran in exactly one direction. The first real crack came from inside the company. In August 2001, an Enron vice president named Sharon Watkins wrote an anonymous memo to CEO Kenneth Lay warning that the company might, in her words, implode in a wave of accounting scandals. Around the same time, a Fortune journalist named Bethany McLean published an article with a simple, uncomfortable headline question: how, exactly, does Enron make money? Nobody at the company could give her a straight answer. That alone should have been the story. Instead, it took months more before the truth started surfacing publicly, and by then, Enron's debt-hiding partnerships were already unraveling under their own weight. Enron's aggressive trading culture wasn't limited to accounting. Internal recordings later surfaced showing energy traders openly joking about manipulating California's electricity market during the state's 2000 to 2001 energy crisis, deliberately taking power plants offline to spike prices and profit from the resulting shortages. Ordinary Californians faced rolling blackouts while Enron traders, on tape, celebrated. It was a preview of the same institutional attitude that later powered the accounting fraud. Rules were something to be cleverly maneuvered around, not followed. In October 2001, Enron restated its earnings, wiping out roughly $600 million in previously reported profits, and revealing over $6 billion in debt that had been hidden off the books for years. The stock, which had traded above $90 a share barely a year earlier, went into freefall. By December 2001, Enron filed for bankruptcy at the time, the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. Arthur Andersen, facing charges of obstruction of justice for shredding Enron-related documents, effectively collapsed as a firm within months, taking with it 85,000 jobs that had nothing to do with the fraud itself. Enron employees lost an estimated $2 billion in retirement savings, much of it tied up in company stock that employees had been actively encouraged to hold, even as executives were quietly selling their own shares. Jeffrey Skilling was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy and served over a decade in federal prison. Kenneth Lay was convicted as well, but died before sentencing. Andrew Fastow pleaded guilty and cooperated with prosecutors, serving roughly 6 years. The scandal directly led to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, a sweeping overhaul of corporate accounting rules that still governs how public companies report their finances today. The law introduced criminal penalties for executives who knowingly certify false financial statements, required stricter independence between auditing and consulting work at accounting firms, and created a new oversight board specifically to regulate how public company audits are conducted. Sharon Watkins, the executive whose internal memo had warned Kenneth Lay months before the collapse, later testified before Congress and became one of the most recognized corporate whistleblowers in American history. Bethany McLean, the journalist who first publicly asked how Enron actually made money, went on to co-author one of the definitive books on the scandal, titled with the same question that started it all. Jeffrey Skilling's original 24-year prison sentence was later reduced on appeal to just over 14 years, following a Supreme Court ruling that narrowed one of the legal theories prosecutors had used against him. He was released in 2019. Kenneth Lay's conviction was ultimately vacated after his death, under a legal doctrine that voids convictions when a defendant dies before exhausting the appeals process, meaning that technically no conviction against Enron's own CEO survives on the record today. Enron's fraud wasn't really about hiding money in some secret account nobody could find. It was about using the accounting rulebook itself and the conflicted incentives of the people meant to enforce it to make real debt legally invisible. Nothing about the core trick required breaking the law until it required breaking the law to keep hiding it. There's a broader pattern worth naming here. Enron's fraud depended on complexity as camouflage, mark-to-market accounting, special purpose entities, layered partnerships. None of it was individually incomprehensible, but stacked together, the structure became complicated enough that very few people outside the company, and not many inside it either, could actually trace how the pieces connected. Complexity, used deliberately, doesn't just hide fraud. It exhausts the people whose job is to find it, until they eventually stop looking closely enough to catch it. The numbers always tell the story eventually. The question, as always, is who's still listening by then. Enron was rated investment grade 4 days before it went bankrupt. If that unsettles you, it should, and it's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe for the next one.